Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 19, Section 1, The First New Deal. So follow along. Here we go. In Chapter 18, we talked a little bit about the start of the Great Depression, and in our notes, I had mentioned that in 1932, we had an election year. Herbert Hoover was elected president in 1928, and a lot of folks were not happy with what he was doing as far as trying to help our nation through the Great Depression. And hence, people were looking for someone different. And here comes FDR. Even though FDR had some issues physically, as a young man, he was diagnosed with polio, which is an illness that, for the most part, in children can stunt growth. It can lead to a child, when they're developing, to maybe have their limbs or bones develop at varying rates. So you might have one leg that's longer than the other. But needless to say, he developed this as an adult, and it certainly impacted his ability to control his muscles as far as his legs were concerned. And for the most part, he was kind of bound to a wheelchair after his diagnosis. But most Americans didn't even realize he was in a wheelchair. Matter of fact, the photo that you see in the bottom left-hand corner is one of the few rare photos that was ever taken of FDR while he was president, sitting in a wheelchair. Most people never saw him in that state and really didn't even realize that he had this disability. But needless to say, one of the things that he promised is that if he were elected, the happy days would be here again. And for some Americans, that was enough to seal the deal for them voting for him. If you look at the map, kind of in the bottom center of your page, this is what we would call an electoral map. The states that are kind of colored orange are those states that voted for FDR. The states that are kind of in the green are people who voted for the Republican Party, primarily for Hoover. And as you can see, it was pretty much a landslide for FDR. He won the Midwest, he won the South, he won the West. Didn't necessarily do so hot in New England, but needless to say, he certainly had enough electoral votes to seal the deal and win this election. So his popularity, particularly in the state of New York, helped him immensely. He had been governor there. Matter of fact, if you go back towards the beginning of the 1920s, he had actually was a vice presidential candidate on the ticket in 1920 prior to his polio diagnosis. But after that, he actually served as governor of New York, following in the footsteps of his distant cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, which is kind of interesting. Both men of differing political parties, FDR being a Democrat and Theodore Roosevelt being a Republican. But needless to say, just the whole idea of someone who promised something other than what was happening really made it easy for a lot of Americans to vote for him. When he came into the White House, one of the things that he did to kind of calm the nerves of our nation was he started using a series of what we call fireside chats. And fireside chats were basically a series of radio broadcasts. He would sit primarily in the White House or his vacation residencies, and he would talk to the nation. And what's interesting about how FDR was able to communicate is he never spoke above the people. In other words, he had an ability to reach out to people of, that are young, people who were not well educated, the wealthy and the astute. He could speak to the heart of everyone. And it seemed like everybody understood what he had to say. And that's what makes FDR kind of a well-known guy and a president that a lot of folks still admire yet in this day and age. One of the things that he promised coming into the White House was that he was going to initiate some programs that were going to help our nation. And over the years, it's kind of gotten a nickname known as Alphabet Soup, the New Deal, which was his domestic program. Every president has kind of what I would call a deal. If you go back to Theodore Roosevelt, he had what was called the Square Deal. And if you go on, you can talk about, John F. Kennedy and the Great Society and such. But some of the programs that you see here are kind of rightly named Alphabet Soup. A lot of these programs are known by their acronyms: the FDIC, the CPA, the SEC, the SSA, and TVA, and CCC, and such. But the goal of all of these programs was basically to do the following: to provide relief from, the economic uncertainties of the Great Depression, some recovery for our nation to bring back maybe the good days when our economy was thriving, and then reform. And the reform part was to make sure that there would be some government oversight on certain aspects of our economy to prevent things from happening that would lead us into another economic depression. So sometimes this is known as the 3 R's, the relief, recovery, reform. All of these are really kind of the goal of these alphabet programs. And as we go through chapter 19, we're going to talk about some of these different programs. We're going to talk about a few of them here in section 1, and then we'll continue onward. But we're going to go on and we're going to talk about a few of these. The Security and Exchange Commission, or sometimes known as the SEC. This was created really at the beginning of Roosevelt's administration as a way to regulate the stock market and prevent fraud that was happening on Wall Street. If you remember the stock market crash of 1929, certainly there was some panic on Wall Street when there was a sell-off of stocks and such. And what the SEC can do is it can regulate. It can actually halt trading on Wall Street. Matter of fact, in the last few weeks, we have seen that happen as a result of the coronavirus and such. It can also do some other things. It can also talk about the requirements to issue stocks. It can talk about how stocks are traded. For example, it investigates people who might be involved in what is called insider trading, meaning like I know what's going to happen with a certain company, like they're going to announce that they're going to maybe stop production of a certain plant and that they're going to lose some money. And if I get wind of that ahead of time, I might go in and sell off those stocks. It prevents those things from happening. And in a way, it makes Wall Street a little more predictable when we talk about the trading of stocks. Okay, another program is known as the Glass-Steagall Act, but it's not really known as that so much as the acronym that you might see in number 6 here. The Glass-Steagall Act was an act that was going to help protect our banks. Commercial banks could no longer risk depositors' money by using it to speculate on the stock market. And part of that Glass-Steagall Act is known as the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This whole idea that your savings, if you put money into a savings account, it's going to be insured to a certain dollar amount. Now, years ago, the amount was obviously a lot smaller than it is today. Today, we're talking a couple $150,000, like $250,000 that might be protected. But the idea is so that way you don't go panicking and running to the bank, causing a run on a bank where people would be withdrawing their money in a slew of panic. This way, our banks are going to be able to be there when we need them. And number 7, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or the HOLC, was designed to help homeowners, pay their mortgages. Mortgage, for the most part, is like the loan that you take out to buy a home. Not every person does this, but a lot of people do in this day and age. And so if you're without a job, you might not be able to make that payment. And what this is going to do is to protect people from losing their homes. Uh, During the early part of the Great Depression, there were a lot of people that were evicted from their homes, and they ended up in those shanty towns. And what this is going to do is it's going to keep people in their homes. It might help them um, extend maybe the time that they're going to pay these mortgages. It might lower their monthly charges, but the idea is to keep people in their place so that they're not losing, uh, their home and the things that they consider to be very valuable to them. All right, number 8, the idea behind the Agricultural Adjustment Act was that prices for farm goods were low because farmers grew too much food. And what the AAA was going to do was to tell farmers what they could produce and how much. So, if we're looking at, a situation where there is like a glut, too much wheat or too much corn in the market, what they're going to do is tell farmers that they need to take a certain amount of land out of production. Over the years in agriculture, there's been different programs to kind of help with this same issue with overproduction. And you might have heard of CRP land in the 1980s. The idea that you were going to take so many acres out of production, kind of reverting them back to maybe the natural state. So, encouraging people to plant maybe grass or other things on this land just so that it wasn't being used in production. Well, the AAA kind of had some of the same ideas. It also encouraged some farmers to cut back when we talk about the herd size, like livestock and such. At some point in time, the first Agricultural Adjustment Act is going to be challenged in the Supreme Court, and eventually it's going to be found unconstitutional. But that isn't going to stop our government. They're actually going to issue a second AAA, and we're going to talk a little bit about it in Section 2 here. The National Industrial Recovery Act, number 9, provided industry with a set of rules that were known as codes of fair compensation. And this is to help those employees who have been working, kind of those blue collar jobs in factories, keep a certain wage or to protect their jobs. The CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, this is one that really helped a lot of people in our nation, really even in the Midwest here. But it was designed primarily for young men ages 18 to 25. And what they were going to do is they were going to go off away from their families, and they would kind of train like you would in basic training for the military. You would live in barracks, you would get up and do calisthenics. But what they were going to do is do things that are going to help with conservation. And so they might have planted trees or helped fight forest fires or build, reservoirs and things like that. In our neck of the woods, they might have helped with maybe setting up shelter belts for farmers so that we could, prevent these dust storms from taking the topsoil away. They might have helped build state parks. I know in Nebraska, Ponca State Park, Chadron State Park, all had CCC members helping building basically cabins and trails and such. But you could see it throughout the nation. Matter of fact, in Platte County, not very far from Monastery Road, around 325th Street, there's actually a marker in our county that talks about the Platte County CCC camp that was there. So if you ever happen to be driving out and about in the country, you might see that Nebraska state marker, but that's in recognition of this. Okay, all of that is part of the CCC. All right, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or the FERA, this channeled money into local and state agencies to help fund their relief projects. That can vary from state to state a little bit. By insisting that contractors not discriminate against African Americans, the Public Works Administration broke down some of the long-standing racial barriers in the construction trades. So if if somebody wanted to receive these government fundings, they had to prove that they were hiring minorities, primarily African Americans. And that certainly changed some of the practices that were happening when we talk about employment. And eventually it's going to lead to further employment protections for minorities down the line. And number 13, the Civilian Works Administration. This employed roughly 4 million people during the winter of 1933 and 34, including 300,000 women. You got to understand, kind of leading up until the Great Depression, not a lot of women were in the workplace. I mean, women for the most part were, if they were single, yeah, they might be working outside of the home. But once a person married, you were kind of like relegated to being a homemaker. And with the Depression, there was such a need for income that even women were looking for work. And this is one of those, I guess you could call it alphabet programs that certainly encouraged the hiring of women. And number 14, perhaps the most important result of the first New Deal, was probably the noticeable change in the spirit of Americans. People were feeling better about, the world that they were living in. Granted, the Depression wasn't over. When we talk about economic factors, I mean, there's kind of ups and downs in the 1930s. And the Depression really isn't going to end until we get to about the beginning of World War II. But needless to say, these programs did help change the spirit. Thank you very much.